Welcome back, everyone. For this video, we're going to be doing a slightly different format. So I have found a way to utilize my previous Adobe Presenter videos that I had just updated last semester. I'm going to be using some screen capture software. So my video here will be popping in and out as I need to add comments. So let's give this a try. For this video, we're going to be covering one of my favorite theories, which is behaviorism. I find behaviorism to be very applicable to teaching in a variety of ways and also very interesting to study. So sit back and let's take a look.
For our agenda, we're going to be looking at what is behaviorism in general and then focusing specifically on classical conditioning. Let's start with some basic assumptions that outline what behaviorists believe. So first of all, here's how they define learning. A relatively permanent change in behavior. This is not all that much different from previous theories except for their focus on behavior. And let me explain in the next slide how that differs from what we've seen with theorists like Piaget, for instance. So why study behavior? Behaviorists want to be scientists. So to be a true scientist, you have to do research, and you can only research, according to them, things that you can measure. And they believe that you can't really observe things like accommodation or mental schemas or the memory model. They want to do what they consider to be hard science, which is focused on looking at observable behaviors. Their second big assumption is that this learned behavior is mainly the result of the environment. They don't focus on genetics or biology in any way whatsoever. In fact, they really like the idea of tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is the notion that you're born without behavioral tendencies, and that it is the environment that makes you who you are. You may have asked yourself, why are they only looking at the environment? Why do they seem to ignore things like the role of biology or genetics? Well, to understand this, you have to go back in time. When the behaviorists were starting to put together their theories, there was another movement going on across the world called eugenics. The picture I'm showing you is from a World War II propaganda poster. Eugenics was a pseudo-scientific movement trying to look at only biology and that people are born into a certain caste, and some people should therefore prosper and others should perhaps be eradicated. And the behaviorists saw this as very troubling, and so they kind of did the exact opposite and said, you know what, we're only going to focus on the environment. It doesn't matter what your biology is. In fact, here's a very famous quote from one of our first behaviorists in the United States. Give me a dozen healthy infants well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select, regardless of things like, as you can see at the bottom, their abilities and the race of his ancestors. So this was very eye-opening and different from what was going on in many scientific communities. Here's a short video to put you again back in time to see what was going on during these early behaviorist work.
But not everyone believes that biology is destiny. For many scientists, it's your experiences in life that count. Your upbringing, your education, your environment. Chief among these scientists is psychologist John Watson, who offers a theory that is the mirror opposite of eugenics.
This was the heyday of hereditarians and geneticists who said that human beings were constrained by their genetic inheritance. And Watson was saying that this is baloney. that human beings were shaped solely by their environment.
Over the years, Watson studies the behavior of babies, hundreds of them. To Watson, we arrive in the world a blank slate, tabula rasa. Nearly everything is learned, even things we think are instinctual, like fear.
I'm going to pause here and jump in. At the end of that video, I know it was kind of hard to hear because of the crying babies, but they said something important. The behaviors were trying to show that everything, or nearly everything, is learned. And that even things that we think might be instinctual in a person, like being fearful, is also learned. We're going to see how John Watson tries to prove that later on. But first, let's move forward.
Another important assumption is about how this learning takes place. So to behaviorists, the way learning occurs is because of the relationship between stimuli and responses. Now, if it's been a while and you're not exactly sure what I mean by a stimulus or a response, the stimulus is an object or an event. It's a thing. It's something in the environment. So in this picture below, there are two stimuli, onion breath and the kiss. That would be the event. Then there's the response. The response is the behavior that occurs in reaction to or because of the stimulus. So in this circumstance, the response would be some sort of arousal. Now, I purposely chose this unusual example because I thought it might be novel and somehow stick in your mind.
And I'm also going to pause, pardon me, and jump in. So the way classical conditioning works is, let's say you have onion breath, and then you kiss your significant other, and the person feels some sort of arousal because of the kiss. Over time, if that is a pattern, eventually a strange thing might occur that simply the smell of onion might cause them to feel some sort of excitement or arousal because of its connection to the passionate kiss. But let's continue.
To continue with this third assumption, I wanted to add a bit more detail that learning is more likely to happen when that stimulus and response occur close together. We call this contiguity, and when it happens repeatedly. So for instance, if the onion breath occurred on Monday and the kiss occurred on Tuesday, it is unlikely that a relationship would be formed. Similarly, if it only happened once, it is unlikely that the relationship would be formed. But if every single date they go have Italian, and every single date leads to onion breath, followed by a kiss, then you would start to see a pattern or some sort of learning occur. And number 4, many species of animals, and remember humans are included as animals, learn in similar ways. This is an important assumption for behaviorists because they do study animals. Their experiments are so controlled that they typically can't do them with human beings. You can't put us in a box all day and have us push levers. So they study animals, they apply what they observe to humans, and assume that there's some similarity, that if you can teach a rat to run a maze by reinforcing them with food, that perhaps you can do something similar to help humans learn by reinforcing them with food. Okay, so there are 2 types of conditioning that behaviorists prescribe to, classical and operant. This module is only going to be focusing on the classical conditioning. I thought I'd get us started with a couple of funnies. So the one on the right is funny because the cat is running the electric can opener and the other cats hear it, so they're coming over. But anyway, let's get started and see what classical conditioning is about. So, can any of you relate to these pictures, especially if you have pets? Well, these memes actually represent classical conditioning, that the cats have learned to associate a noise with a certain event, And the cat on the left, obviously, is an event that they don't like. The cats on the right is an event that perhaps they do like. Classical conditioning is all about learning by pairing an automatic response to a new stimuli. That is the shortest, the most succinct description I could come up with. And this is really a great way of explaining why sometimes people have an emotional reaction to something that really seems neutral, why they might get really upset about something or really happy about something. Before we go any further, I thought I'd ask, do you remember what happened with Pavlov's study? Think about what you recall from intro psych. Now let's go forward and do a little review. So, Ivan Pavlov. To just introduce him a bit, he was a Russian physiologist who was actually interested in studying digestion, but he accidentally discovered classical conditioning. So, he taught dogs to salivate to a bell, and he actually used a bunch of different stimuli, but we tend to focus on the bell, presented prior to feeding them. So, he had a study where he was collecting saliva while the dogs ate to look at this in relation to digestion. And then he started to notice that they were salivating before he even gave them the food. We're going to watch a short video on the next slide to show you how this happened.
Ivan Pavlov noticed that his dogs began to salivate shortly before being fed. So he designed an experiment in which he would ring a bell before feeding his dogs. After several times, his dogs began to correctly associate the ringing of a bell with the presentation of food. After enough times, Pavlov could ring his bell at any time, and the dogs would begin to salivate, whether they were being presented with food or not, because they had been conditioned to do so.
Let's do a quick run through. So, food unconditionally causes the dog to salivate, meaning they don't have to learn it, it always happens. A bell should not cause that reaction. So, those are our beginning steps. However, if you pair bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, the dog will be salivating because of the food, but they start to recognize that the bell is a precursor to the food. And then after enough pairings, the bell alone becomes that conditioned response to cause salivation. Here's a good everyday example of how you might see this happen with dogs in your life. So perhaps they hear a sound every time before you feed them, and now they get excited when they just hear that sound. There are all sorts of ways that you might also be classically conditioned. Perhaps you're sitting in the dentist waiting room and you hear the drill and it makes you sweat or get a little anxious. Or a certain smell makes you feel a certain way. Or certain taste aversions you have. All of those fit. So I thought this was just funny and relevant, but it does show how classical conditioning can occur in a variety of ways. Here's a short video from the office that I think does a good job of showing how classical conditioning can occur.
Oh, damn, that's another file. I have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid? What do you think? In school, we learned about this scientist who trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by feeding them whenever a bell rang. So for the past couple of weeks, I've been conducting a similar experiment. Dwight, one Alto. Okay. Alto? Sure. And Dwight? Been pretty? Yes. What are you doing? What? I don't know. My mouth is so bad all of a sudden.
So do you have any examples of how you might have been classically conditioned? The one that stands out the most for me is this one. When I was a kid, every time I was sick, I had 7-Up and crackers. And so I have to admit, it is a drink I don't like still to this day. So after Pavlov was done with his study, he went back to studying digestion. So this left this whole field kind of dangling out there waiting for someone to take over. John Watson was that person. Therefore, he is given the title the founder of behaviorism. He did not create it. He took Piaget's work and then just delved deeper into it. John Watson is also best known for his infamous and unethical study, the Little Albert Experiment. So I thought I'd ask, do you remember? Can you explain what the Little Albert Experiment was all about? Well, we're going to watch a short video, but remember in the beginning, Albert did not show any fear of the white rat. The only thing that made him upset was a loud noise. Here is the video. It is also archival footage, so it's quite old, but it's going to let you see what exactly was done for this study.
To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little Albert. He's so confident, he films it for posterity. At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then, Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise. One of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the Little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned.
I bet many of you are feeling like this right now, and if so, you're not alone. The Little Albert study was groundbreaking for the field of fear and phobias, but it also started the field of psychology really looking at the ethical treatment of individuals in their experiments. Now, I'm going to warn you that we're going to be going down the rabbit hole and taking a couple of interesting but short tangents, but do keep in mind that they are relevant. Let's continue with the Little Albert experiment. Even though it was unethical, it did have an important finding. It showed that fears can be learned. Now, what does that mean? Well, if they can be learned, they can also be unlearned, which is really important when it comes to therapy and psychologists and how they treat people with anxiety and phobias. You see, prior to this finding, the treatments available for people with anxiety or phobias or similar psychological issues was not necessarily appropriate. So we have hysteria therapy. Hysteria is what they would label women who had anxiety or similar issues. Sometimes they would tell you that the solution was to get married and have children. Sometimes they said it was because you were possessed by a demon. Then we had the bathtub treatment, where they would put you in a frigid, cold bathtub filled with water and ice cubes, thinking that that might help. Or what about spinning treatments? This is where they would spin you extremely fast, sometimes until you would throw up, thinking that would help. This was actually created by Charles Darwin's grandfather. Oh, here's another one. We also had orgone therapy, where you would be shut up in this small contraption to try to rid yourself of the orgone energy causing you problems. That was one of Freud's followers. We have phrenology, feeling the bumps on your head to try to understand why you do the things that you do, and mesmerism, using magnets and iron rods. So, this finding is pretty big, that if fears can be learned, then we have a real better understanding of how to help people with them, and that phobias, in fact, might just be the result of classical conditioning and trying to avoid an aversive stimulus. So, for instance, at the end of the little Albert experiment, most likely little Albert had a fear of white rats that turned into a phobia. And his phobia was simply the result of his classical conditioning. Now, I would like to point out that some fears are rational. Fears of spiders, fears of snakes, fears of falling, so on. That is not what a phobia is. Here's a list of just some phobias. You might notice that some of these are a bit unusual. Fear of dust, fear of men, fear of churches, fear of rain, fear of beards. So the idea is that these items are aversive stimulus because something early in life caused you to be truly frightened, and all these things are perhaps just the neutral stimuli that you were classically conditioned to. Fear of beards. Think about all the children who are traumatized by their first visit to Santa, and what is right at eye level? A beard. I like to point out that is my daughter. I do feel bad that I bought the photos, but I can see how it's useful, and I can see why some children might end up with a fear of beards. Here are some real examples of aversion therapy. Have you ever known anyone who put a rubber band around their wrist and then would flick themselves to try to stop a bad habit? Or there's actually a product called Pavlok bracelets that will shock you to, again, get you to stop a bad habit. The idea that if pain is associated with, let's say, biting your fingernails, perhaps you'll stop biting your fingernails. Here's a real-life practical application of aversion therapy. So, in some areas, farmers have a hard time with coyotes killing their sheep. Rather than going out and shooting the coyotes, why not classically condition them to be, shall we say, phobic of the sheep? So you sprinkle some sheep meat with something that's going to make them sick, and they will start to avoid live sheep. So here's the second part of my rabbit hole. John Watson, not for notes, but I think it's important to point out, he did leave the field of psychology due to a variety of scandals, not just the little Albert experiment. And he went into advertising, and he was actually very successful because he applied classical conditioning to make people want to buy a product. Here's one of the ads from the company he went to, and so the idea is to put a picture up that evokes a feeling. So this picture would hopefully evoke positive feelings. And then those positive feelings get connected to the product to make you want to buy the product. Here are some other ads from a couple of decades later, and you can see the beginning of starting to introduce sex into advertising. So again, to cause you to have a feeling that you then want to connect to that product. Believe it or not, one of the best ways I can explain this is from the following clip from Family Guy.
Pardon the intrusion. The video wasn't working in that format, so we'll try it here below.
Why Peter looks sad?
Brian, Peter invent wheel. Peter show wheel to people in town, but no one want wheel. Everyone excited about trapezoid. No one buy wheel.
Peter, you invent wheel? That big breakthrough. This maybe make you millionaire.
Then how come no one buy Peter wheel?
Maybe sales pitch not good enough. Brian, help. Okay, sell wheel, just like practice.
Not sure can do it.
You so money, don't know it.
Hi, meet Peter. Tired walking every place? Need something make you go? Peter wheel make you go. Brian, Peter fail again.
Not so fast. Brian have other idea.
Anyone by wheel gets dead bird.
Not working. Try drastic measure.
Ryan, what hell?
Hot lady next to wheel. Make me want wheel. Maybe if me buy wheel, me get pretty lady too. I buy wheel.
People want Peter wheel thanks to sexy wife. Tonight, you and me party like it's 9.
Damn all. What deuce?
Okay, so basically, the comments by the caveman are supposed to illustrate what classical conditioning and advertising is all about. Hot lady next to wheel, make me want wheel. Maybe if me buy wheel, me get pretty lady too. So, classical conditioning in advertising.
Here are some other popular ads from the last couple of years, and I think you can see what they have in common. They all evoke a feeling that gets connected to the product that makes you want to buy the product. Okay, Ryan Gosling, I get the message. Let's get back on track. So, classical conditioning. Rather than going over the terminology that I know you went over ad nauseum in your intro psych class, I'm going to go over the steps. So how does this happen? For the first step, there is a unconditioned, and as you recall, that means unlearned, stimulus-response association. So something that already exists. For instance, food makes babies happy. Babies love their bottle. You don't have to teach them that. Some other examples of unlearned stimulus response associations. You eat bad food, you're going to get sick. You see something funny, you're going to laugh. Get shocked, you have pain, and so on. Then, the next step is what's important. A second neutral stimulus is paired with that existing relationship. So in my example on the right, we add mom. Now that could also be dad, it could be a babysitter. So a person gives the baby a bottle over and over and over again. The neutral stimulus can really be anything, any event or object that occurs right before that unlearned stimulus response association. And as one more little rabbit hole to go down, neutral stimuli have been used quite often in movies. More specifically, they are used in scary movies. In each of these, something happens. There's a neutral stimulus presented right before something fearful or scary. Whether it is Halloween music, Jaws music, Silent Hill foghorn, the telephone ringing on Scream, all of those are neutral stimuli so that by the end of the movie, you only need that neutral stimulus, the Jaws song, the telephone ringing in Scream, to cause fear. For the last step, that neutral stimulus starts to elicit the same response, and then we now call it the conditioned response. So, for our example on the right, whoever gives the baby the bottle starts to cause happiness in the baby. And this can explain why babies can become powerfully attached to whoever it is that feeds them. Now that we have seen the 3 steps for classical conditioning, I wanted you to watch this cute YouTube video created by a college student that really exemplifies them.
Hey Psych 101 class, I'm David and I'm going to be testing Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning on my roommate Brian. The conditioned stimulus will be the sound effect.
That was easy.
And then I'm going to shoot him with this airsoft gun. He will soon learn the relationship between the sound effect and the shot before he gets too hurt.
That was easy. That was easy.
Ah!
That was easy.
Fuck.
That was easy. That was easy.
Alright guys, looks like Pavlov's theory worked.
Now let's look at some other common phenomena that happen in the process of classical conditioning. First, we have generalization. So this is when your conditioned response occurs with other similar stimuli that aren't exactly the same thing as the first one. So you'll see in the cartoon it says Pavlov's neighbor gets a wind chime. So a wind chime isn't the same thing as what Pavlov used, but it's close. And it's close enough that they might generalize their response to that wind chime. Another example, little Albert. He was conditioned to be fearful of the white rabbit. But they found that this fear got generalized to other things that were white and furry. Something else that can happen is extinction. So conditioned responses may not last forever. They can go away. So when that conditioned stimulus occurs over and over and over again without the unconditioned stimulus, the response might start to go away. So in my cartoon, you'll see he's ringing the bell, but the dog doesn't get food. Over time, if you just hear the bell and you don't get food, that response is going to go away. I thought this one was funny too. So let's say you start eating a lot of soup and you're using your can opener a lot, but it doesn't lead to the cat getting food. Eventually they'll stop getting excited about the can opener. So here's the big question. How can we use this in the classroom? It's an unusual theory. It's a pretty cool theory, but how can we use this as teachers? Surprisingly, it is very easy and very effective to use this in the classroom. So what you do is you create a classroom that makes your students feel good. That's going to elicit things like enjoyment or relaxation, not fear and anxiety. Okay, so if you create a classroom where your students feel good, they will associate those positive feelings with your class. They will like your class more. They will be Leo DiCaprio in the top picture. They will want to come to your class. They will be more interested to do your homework. The opposite is, if you create a classroom that makes your students feel bad, they're going to be like poor Keanu there, and they're not going to want to come to your class or learn what you have to say. So, this can help students learn that school is a good place. School is somewhere that they want to be. And yes, they will like your subject matter more. So how can we do this? Well, it can be as simple as being kind and nice and greeting your students at the door. It can be more elaborate. You can have relaxation techniques for your students like those pictured here. On the next slide, you're going to see a video from a pretty famous teacher who's on Facebook and also does some tours as a comedian. And you'll see how one of his big things is about helping his students have fun and feel good.
So this is how my class lines up for recess. For almost every single one of my students. Collectively, I call them my nuggets. So they're all my nuggets. Namaste, class.
All right, so let me see if I can wrap this up. So, in a nutshell, what is classical conditioning? It is pairing together two stimuli to create a new response. So for instance, with Pavlov's example, pairing the bell and the food to stimuli to create a new response. And then the response that is learned up here is involuntary, meaning it is something that you cannot control. Okay? Now, that is what makes classical conditioning different. The thing that you are learning is outside of your control. You cannot help it. Think of Dwight in The Office reaching out his hand for the Altoid. He doesn't even know what he's doing. So in classical conditioning, what you are learning is usually an emotional reaction or a biological response. Think of the dogs salivating. Think of being fearful. Think of being happy. They are things that just kind of happen to you. That makes classical conditioning a bit unusual. So, that is everything for classical conditioning.
And that's all.
Almost jumped in on myself. That's all for now. The next time we'll take a look at a very different type of behaviorism called operant conditioning. So, thank you.